Beneath the vaulted obsidian heights of the Grand Council chamber, the secondary anti-grav suspensors groaned under a weight they were never designed to hold. A single bead of hydraulic fluid escaped a pressurized seal, but instead of falling, it drifted upward toward the ceiling in a slow, panicked arc. Why was the local gravity field weeping while the rest of the station remained in perfect stasis? What we measured that day wasn't just air. It was the crushing weight of a species we should have never invited inside. You'll want to hear the final reading. Across the polished floorboards of the inner sanctum rattled a cleaning cart of primitive, rusted steel. This intrusion into our most sacred proceedings would usually have triggered an immediate security purge, but the high quorum sat in a state of rigid, crystalline paralysis. 12 Valanthe elders, their carapaces shimmering with the pale violet of high-ranking scholars, watched as the human female moved with a stride that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the chamber. I, Valen, stood as the senior council observer, my internal chronometer syncing with the erratic oscillations of the atmospheric sensors. We had convened to discuss the myth of Earth, to dismiss the data ghosts suggesting a bipedal race lived in conditions of extreme environmental violence. The cleaning cart, Alara Vance pushed with a grace that masked the sheer, localized mass of her gear. She did not look at the high quorum, nor did she acknowledge the shimmering holographic displays that were currently flickering in protest of her proximity. Instead, she leaned her mop handle against the heavy translucent pillar of the Great Seal. Rose a collective clicking of mandibles from the elders at this desecration. To us, the seal was a masterwork of spun glass, so delicate that a strong vibration could shatter centuries of history. To her, it was a convenient prop, staggering. Beside her cleaning supplies sat a standard-issue pressure seal coffee cup. It was a scarred, insulated cylinder, the surface pitted by what my optical sensors identified as thermal microstress. Alara reached out, her thick fingers wrapping around the container. With a movement so slight it almost escaped my recording, she pressed her thumb firmly against the center of the lid, a repetitive, rhythmic pressure. My primary analysis suggested a nervous tic, perhaps a biological response to the intimidation of the high quorum's presence. I noted the dampness on her brow and the way her chest moved in deep, labored expansions. We were a species of the void, breathing a mixture so thin it was little more than a whisper of nitrogen. Beneath the crystalline floor, the primary life support processors screamed in a frequency only the military-grade sensors in my crest could detect. The air in the chamber was changing. It was not a leak, but a displacement. Every time Alara Vance exhaled, the atmospheric composition shifted by nearly 0.3%. Her lungs were bellows, processing gas at a density that threatened to overwhelm the room's delicate recycling lattices. The elders shifted their weight, their hollow, porcelain-thin legs trembling as the ambient pressure began to creep upward. We were being drowned in the simple byproduct of a human's respiration. Alara paused her work and raised her left arm, squinting at an analog wristwatch that looked as though it had been forged in the heart of a gravitational well. The strap was a strip of coarse, black polymer, pulled so tight against her skin that it left a deep, angry indentation in the flesh. She sighed, a sound like a hull breach, and adjusted the buckle. It was a routine, boring motion. I watched her, waiting for the moment she would collapse. Her skin was turning a darker shade of pink, and the moisture on her neck was thick enough to catch the flickering light of the suspensors. I assumed her biology was failing, that the thin air of our civilization was finally starving her alien heart of its necessary fuels. Through the dense silence of the chamber, the screech of metal on metal cut through our collective concentration. Alara had moved her cart, the rusted wheels protesting against a floor that had never known the indignity of grit. The high quorum's motivation had always been system preservation, the maintenance of a galaxy that was light, fast, and ethereal. They believed Earth was a fabrication because no life could survive the crushing gravity and thick, poisonous soup of a world with Earth's reported metrics. Yet, as the human girl bent over to retrieve a dropped cloth, The floorboards beneath her boots let out a sharp, crystalline snap. Is she even aware that she is a kinetic weapon in this environment? Across the sensors, the barometric reading for the Grand Council chamber flashed a warning in deep, arterial red. The pressure was no longer creeping. It was surging. The room's automated systems were desperately trying to vent the atmosphere to compensate for the intrusion. But the more they vented, the more Alara Vance seemed to fill the void with her presence. She walked toward the center of the room, her mop bucket trailing a scent of citrus and harsh, industrial bleach that stung my olfactory membranes. To her, it was the smell of a clean floor. To us, it was a chemical assault, a thick vapor that threatened to coat our spiracles in a film of Earth-standard toxins. Between the elders and the humans stood a gap of only 3 standard units, yet it felt like the boundary between 2 incompatible realities. The High Quorum attempted to speak, but the High Elder's voice was a thin, wavering whistle. His internal air sacs were struggling to push against the increasing density of the room. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a biological terror that no training could mask. He wanted me to order a security purge. He wanted the human removed before the room's pressure crushed the very carapaces off their backs. The human girl stopped. She turned her head slowly, her gaze finally landing on the shimmering, terrified figures of the 12 elders. She didn't bow. She didn't scream. She simply reached for her coffee cup again, her thumb once more pinning the lid down with a force that would have snapped my own digits like dry twigs. Against the reinforced obsidian walls of the observation tier leaned the High Elder, his chitinous limbs splayed in a desperate attempt to stabilize his failing respiratory sacs. A single, jagged line his chest plate traced. Running through the intricate violet filigree was a fracture that glowed with the frantic, bioluminescent blue of biological failure. I watched through the sensor screen, my own carapace feeling the first, sickening tremors of environmental stress. Within the sanctum, the weight was becoming tangible, a thick, invisible hand pressing down on every surface. Alara Vance stood motionless in the epicenter of this atmospheric cyclone. She looked at the High Elder, her expression showing nothing but a mild, professional concern. I had assumed her sweating was a sign of impending death, a biological collapse brought on by the thin air of our civilization. Correcting that assumption was the data reading I saw next. She wasn't starving for air. She was finally beginning to breathe normally. The floorboards gave way beneath her, screaming in metallic protest. That specific number, Alara whispered when the High Elder finally collapsed. She stepped toward the center of the room, her mop bucket leaving deep, permanent indentations in the crystalline floor with every inch she moved. The Elder's vocoder whined, a thin sound of grinding glass. He asked how a creature of myth could stand while the galaxy's highest scholars were being crushed into the dirt. It's just 101 kilopascals, Alara said, her voice a quiet anchor in the howling alarm sirens of the chamber. She reached up to adjust her collar, revealing the name tag I had noticed earlier. The melted corner looked like a small, blackened bite taken out of the plastic. She saw me looking at it through the observation glass and offered a small, tired smile. It had happened back at a Sunday barbecue in Scranton. She told the room, a memory of fire and meat and heavy air that seemed to sustain her while it poisoned us. To her, a world that burned at such a density was a place of rest. Total, crushing weight. Came the realization no elder was prepared for. If 101 kilopascals was her baseline, then our galactic standard of 30 was a vacuum. We weren't inviting a diplomat into our halls. We were inviting a deep-sea creature onto a mountain peak. The science was cold and irreversible. Earth's atmospheric pressure is 101.325 kilopascals, more than 3 times the galactic standard. We were the ones living in the thin, fragile margins. Humans were the creatures of the deep, forged in a gravity well so intense that our most reinforced structures were, to them, as flimsy as spun sugar. In a frantic, discordant scramble, the High Quorum attempted to reach the emergency exits. 12 elders, the leaders of 1,000 systems, were reduced to crawling across the floor like wounded insects. Their carapaces were never meant to support their own weight in a room this dense. I watched as the High Elder reached for the airlock, his manipulators trembling with the effort of simply lifting his head. Alara watched them go, her thumb finally lifting from the lid of her coffee cup. The hidden layer of her behavior became clear as she set the container down. The pressure differential was so great that the cup, sealed at Earth standard, was the only thing in the room that wasn't screaming. Beneath her boots, the Grand Council chamber continued to shatter. Alara didn't run for the evacuation pods. She didn't call for help. Instead, she knelt to retrieve a discarded cloth, her movements slow and deliberate. "The mop bucket is heavier," she whispered to the empty, groaning room. In that moment, the stakes of our existence shifted. We were no longer debating the myth of a bipedal race. We were calculating the survival of a galaxy that had just realized its neighbors were walking tanks, built to survive a hellscape we couldn't even breathe in. The emergency mobilization order echoed through the station's corridors, a sound of institutional panic. We were retreating from our own throne room. I fled with the others, my primary manipulator still stinging from the pressure. Alara Vance remained, a lone figure in a chamber that was slowly being crushed by her presence. She wasn't a saboteur. She was simply a girl from Scranton, finishing her shift in a room that wasn't built for the weight of her world. The cup rested on the cart, its steel walls slightly deformed by the vacuum. A thin stream of brown liquid pooled on the floor next to a discarded mop. Beyond the sealed airlock, the emergency lights pulsed in slow, rhythmic intervals. Valen's primary manipulator twitched against the cold surface of the observation rail. A single, curved shard of valanthichitin glittered in the center of the wet floor.